Hi, in this last regression video we are going to be doing some tests, so we can do t-tests or we can do f-tests from regressions. So to show you what I mean, I'm just going to use the example that we did for the regression prediction. So if I bring over my do file, this is what we had last time, where we read in the time series with GDP, unemployment rate, and the CPI. Then we went through and we ran a regression on the natural log of GDP and time, and we predicted. Then we did it, see what that looks like, and then we generated the residual. Finally, I'm going to run a multivariable regression. So I'm going to have, the first thing I'm going to do is generate the natural log of the CPI. So since the CPI is going to grow exponentially, I want to linearize it somehow. So I'm just going to take the natural log. And obviously this wouldn't be the exact correct way to do this, but for this example, it does not matter. So first thing that we're going to do is, after we generate this new variable, the natural log of CPI, I'm going to run a regression on the natural log of GDP. And I'm going to predict with it the natural log of the CPI, the unemployment rate, and my time trend. And then I'm going to go through and predict that variable. So I'm going to predict from this regression. I'm going to call it y hat 1, where I used y hat before with just the basic time trend. And then I'm just going to create a basic line graph. So that's the first thing that we're going to do. And by doing that, the blue line is the actual value of the natural log of GDP, and the red line is my predicted values. And over a basic time trend that we saw from the last video, obviously we're doing a much better job of explaining some of the variation of GDP, especially the cyclical components, so the ups and downs. And in this case, well, you can see that the red line is also kind of rising and falling along with the blue line, but it's also growing upwards as the time trend, as with the time trend. And just to show you the difference very quickly, let me go back to my one with just the time trend. So from my regression with just the time trend, we just have a straight line, but it isn't explaining any of the variation up and down. It's just explaining the general trend upward over time. So this new variable that we had, oh, we gotta run that whole thing again. So the new variable that we have are with our multivariable regression. Not only are we explaining the general trend upwards, but we're also explaining some of the general cyclical nature, as that red line is moving up and down, and it tends to predict fairly well. One question that we may have, so overall, from this regression, we may want to know, are we actually predicting GDP better than a mean? And just from this graph, it's pretty obvious that we are. But Stata automatically tests this, so it's going to be testing whether all of our regression coefficients equal 0 together. So it's a joint hypothesis test of all of our betas jointly equaling 0, and that's the f-test of the regression. And up in the top right quadrant from the regression, we have the first thing that we get is the number of observations, which is 226. But the next thing that we have is we have our f-test. So we have three variables that we're explaining, or three coefficients: CPI, unemployment rate, and time. And then we have 226 minus 3 minus 1, which is 222 degrees of freedom. So we have an f-test with 222. And that's the value of that. So this is the value of our f-test, and the probability of that occurring given this sample is very close to 0. So what this is telling us is, overall, CPI, unemployment rate, and time tend to explain the natural log of GDP much better than just the mean of the natural log of GDP. And this is very, very significant. However, we may be interested in wondering, well, if we go back up to our time regression, which was right up here, we had an f-test that is also highly significant. And in our new regression, if we're just looking at the t-statistics, or the p-values, unemployment rate and CPI are both significant, with our t-values exceeding, or 95, or significant at the 95% level, at least, with the t-stats exceeding 1.96 in magnitude. However, we may be interested in wondering, does the addition of these two variables predict GDP more than just the time variable itself? So we want to run an f-test, not on all three, which is done right here, but we want to run an f-test on these two added predictors that we just added into our multivariate regression. To do that, we can just use the test command. So I ran the regression, and my regression is still in the memory since this is the last regression that I ran. So I can just type in test, and then I want to test the two variables that I had. So I can go LCPI and UN rate. And if I test them based on the last regression that I had, again, I have 2 restrictions and 222 degrees of freedom in the unrestricted regression. This is my f-stat from that test, and this is telling me that it's very unlikely that both the natural log of the CPI and the unemployment rate do not help predict GDP, which was obvious from our graph that we had. Right here. Not only do we have the upward trend, but we have some variation in GDP. And so that's what this f-test is really testing, is does this variation actually contribute significantly to the variation of the blue line? So that's one way that we can just use the simple test command in post-estimation. So we can run f-tests very easily instead of just by running the regression and then using the test command. So if we ever want to restrict something, we can always restrict it easily with the test command.